heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 322, covering the week of August 22nd through August 26th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. The YouTube page is invaluable because it has all of our great Abbeville U videos, as well as this podcast and other lectures from our summer schools and other conferences. It's a great free source. But if you do like the videos, click on that little heart button underneath, that super thanks button, and throw a few pennies our way. Of course, we do exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you like everything we do, consider a monthly, annual, or a one-time gift. Just go to abbevilleinstitute.org. That's A-B-B-E-V-I-L-L-E, institute.org. You can click on that donate button right there, or support, and you can throw however much money you want our way, right? We appreciate everything you contribute to the Institute. While you're there, give us that email address, and we'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition. You get on our email list, and you get our articles and other things, notifications of upcoming Zoom conferences or other conferences, any kind of material we have, anything we need to contact you about, we do it through email primarily. So you want to get on that email list, and you want to make sure you whitelist us. Don't let us go to your spam folder. Make sure you are getting our emails. Also, don't forget to click on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can get our logo and all kinds of high-quality embroidered material. It's a great way to advertise the Institute. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Let people know you like it. Share it around on social media. Do everything you can to spread the message and get people listening to the Institute. All right. Well, this week we're going to talk about perception. It's a very important topic, perception. So we often hear the idea, two things, and I'm going to talk about it with two big topics first. One of them is John C. Calhoun and slavery, and that the only thing that Calhoun was really ever interested in was slavery. That defined his career. The other, of course, is that Confederate monuments were put on courthouse lawns to intimidate minority voters so that they wouldn't go and vote, or they wouldn't go and they knew that they weren't part of the political process. This was a way to show the superiority of white Southerners over black Southerners, and this was done as an in-your-face move to support segregation and Jim Crow. Those are two things, two narratives that circulate quite widely now, whether it's in the academy, because you've had books published on both of these things, of course, or on mainstream media, social media. It doesn't matter where you go. This is what you're going to find. If you post anything about Calhoun, you're going to get a response, well, slavery. If you post anything about Confederate monuments or Confederate symbols, well, Jim Crow. In fact, this last week we had a monument in North Carolina bulldozed because the city council voted 4-1 to take it down, and the mayor of this North Carolina town actually live streamed it. Now, this is against the law in North Carolina, so I wonder if they're going to arrest the mayor for being there and actually authorizing the bulldozing of the monument. But I'm not going to hold my breath, right? But regardless, the perception is, of course, and that monument was put up in 1928. But the perception is, of course, all these things were erected to support Jim Crow. Well, we know that's not true. We know 1928, 1919. I mean, these years matter because generally these years are corresponding with some type of anniversary, 50th anniversary, 35th anniversary, 100th anniversary, 75th anniversary, whatever it is. That's when people were putting these things up. And they were doing it with funds raised for the Confederate dead. And we know this because that's what they said, right? They wrote this stuff down. Now, of course, the opponents will say, but wait a second. These people made racist speeches during these monuments. Look at what they said. Just go read their speeches. This is what they're all about. And, of course, the most famous example is the Julian Carr speech at Silent Sam, where he makes where he talks about whipping a black woman. And, I mean, this was, then said, well, the whole monument then is racist because Julian Carr said this, regardless of the fact that Julian Carr had also raised money for black schools and other things. Now, a historian who's now at Auburn University wrote a book about this, And I've mentioned it, I think, on this podcast before, and it's different from some of the other books because it's actually better researched than others. I think it was his dissertation, and then he led him to get a job at Auburn. But the fact is, he makes the case that, well, Carr wasn't as racist as this guy, but he was racist, and so all monuments racist. It's not, there's a non sequitur there, right? Because of the people putting it up were one way doesn't mean the monument is. And so, but this is the problem with all this stuff. It's illogical. But we have a monument in Virginia, or we had a Confederate monument in Virginia in Fairfax County. It stood on the courthouse lawn, and it was taken down ostensibly because of the impression this monument was erected for Jim Crow, to intimidate people and make sure they didn't come and vote, or they weren't going to get equal justice or fairness in trials here in Fairfax County, Virginia. And so the monument had to go. Well, this monument was dedicated in 1890, right? 1890, and October of 1890, in fact. And they told you what the monument was for. In fact, if you go out and you read the newspaper articles of the day, or you read other things that were written about it, they're very clear about why that monument was put on the Fairfax County courthouse ground. First of all, the idea that these monuments were selected for, the place selected was courthouse grounds because they wanted to intimidate people is just complete hogwash, right? I mean, this is a friendly show, so I won't say what it really is, but complete hogwash. And because there are many Union monuments on courthouse grounds as well. It was selected because that was the most public place for these things. And I mean, the courthouse was kind of the center of town usually. And so you wanted it in the center of town so people could enjoy the monument. And in this particular case, the people who raised money for this monument very clearly said what they're raising it for: in memory of the Confederate dead. That's what they raised the money for, in memory of the Confederate dead. And the women who erected the monument wanted it to be on Fairfax soil, and this is a quote, so that the grassy mound at the base of this monument now covers the remains of 200 heroes. End quote. So the idea was to put the monument there for Confederate dead. But I mean, I'm sure it was done to intimidate voters. I'm sure it was done to intimidate people and said that they couldn't get any equal justice. That's why it was there. I'm sure of it, because that's the real meaning of it. There's a conspiracy, right? This is a conspiracy. They're just saying these things because they want to lie. One of the other things, of course, is that the lost cause was created after the war, this idea the war wasn't about slavery. You know who said that a lot during the war? Well, Northern Democrats, who were pointing out the Republicans were not waging the war to end slavery. They were hypocritical. And so this is another impression you get, right? Northern Democrats often called out the Republicans for not waging the war to end slavery. You know who admitted that? Well, the Republicans. So this is the funniest part about all of this, that you have all of these perceptions about the war, about monuments, about individuals, that are all based on a pack of lies. The entire righteous cause narrative, the entire leftist myth, or even neoconservative myth or Straussian myth about the South and the war is built on a pack of lies. It's sad. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad, or dangerous, ultimately. But it's based on stupidity. And this is what we have passing for history in America. Now, it doesn't mean that some Southerners weren't, of course, dedicated to the institution of slavery. In fact, many were. They viewed it as their labor and, of course, in many ways, their social status in society. There's no doubt about this. There were Southerners that believed that. But to say that you create a false dichotomy when you say the North was fighting against slavery, or the South was fighting for slavery and the North was fighting against slavery, it creates a false dichotomy because most Northerners are not fighting against slavery. They made that very clear. Even, again, the radical Republicans who made speech after speech, some would say the war is about slavery. Some would point it back at the South and say, well, you said it's about slavery. We're But at first it's about union, now it's about slavery. So there's all kinds of things going on at this particular period of time that make this much more complex than just slavery freedom, slavery liberty, slavery versus whatever it is, or South bad, North good. There's a whole lot going on here. And then after the war's over, the fact that Southerners talked about the war wasn't really about slavery. Northern Democrats are saying the exact same thing during the war. It's documented. And this is the speech that Clement Vallandigham made in July of 1861. He makes that case. In July of 1861, he makes that case. That's why he had to be banished, because he was calling out the North for what it really was, a bunch of hypocrites, a bunch of imperialists. And you know what else? They said that too. The radical Republicans were very open about being cultural imperialists and ultimately international imperialists. They said these things. So the speech that we reproduced in October of 1890 by John W. Daniel, the lame lion of Lynchburg. This guy's, he was prolific when it came to these kind of speeches. Also made speeches in favor of Washington. He was at the dedication for the Washington Monument. He's from Virginia. He viewed Southern history the way that we do at the Institute, which is more than just a 4-year period. It was a long period of time, and he thought the South should be celebrated throughout its many hundred years. At that point, a couple hundred years. Now we're getting into almost 300 years in his life, but now now over 400 years of history. This is a long period of time. And this speech is amazing. And he says a couple of really interesting things. He said, if the War of 1861 was a mistake, then the War of 1776 was a mistake. In both, we were confronted by similar problems, requiring a similar solution. And the forces of both were nearly a century old before they were set in motion. And the Constitution of the United States had the institution of slavery its cornerstone. And the fugitive slave law, which the North openly violated, had its birth nearly a century before in New England, where the first assertion of states' rights was made. And where the South urged, in the interest of the entire country, the right of local self-government bequeathed to them the priceless heritage of their fathers, these people denied it. So, he's saying, look, this thing was born 100 years before it actually happened. And he said New England was pushing secession. It's amazing when you go out and you look again at these speeches the Republicans made in the 1860s. They just conveniently gloss over the period of secession in New England. They don't even talk about that. They just go right to nullification. You see? They go right to that. Which is very interesting. Because, of course, that puts the onus back on the South, that they were the ones who were always opposing, and illegally in their mind opposing the central government. But, of course, we know this is, the entire United States believed, the founding generation believed in independence. They believed that states could leave the Union if they wanted. In fact, it's why Randolph of Virginia was so insistent that the Constitution be ratified, because he thought if it wasn't, you were going to see disunion across the United States. It was the threat of disunion, an implicit recognition that disunion was possible, even under the Articles of Confederation, which was supposed to be a perpetual union, that found many looking to the Constitution to try to shore up the central authority so that people wouldn't leave the Union. Because they knew it could be done. Because they knew that disunion was a distinct possibility, and it wasn't illegal. And they knew that they probably wouldn't fight to keep any of these states in the Union. They just weren't going to do it. So this speech is really good. And again, Warwick Daniel makes a lot of the same arguments that we've made on this podcast, on the website before, about the war and other things. But he talks about, he's very positive about things. And of course, it's very retrospective. And one of the things he says at the end of the speech, he says, I am reminded of the beautiful dream of the Italian. A fairy presented him with a land of sunshine, beautiful flowers, clear and sparkling waters. Then were fountains at every hand. He passed on slowly, noticing the changes as he followed the limpid streams toward their source. At every turn the land became more rugged, flowers less abundant, until he reached the cold, rocky, snow-clad Alps themselves. so will the South find the sources of her new life in the fearful storms through which her heroic sons and daughters have passed. And of these fair daughters has history yet to pin its just tribute. To them I bow, for my tongue is insufficient to the task. The women of the South were the genius that inspired her sons to valor. These noble Spartan women sent their boys forth with true lessons learned at the knee, sent them forth with bread in their knapsacks and mother's Bible to keep them true. 'Twas the mothers of this fair Southland, it was her sisters and wives and other dear ones whose loving faces kept bright the honor and deeds of her men. God bless you, women of Virginia and of the South. The memory of thy brave boys who have passed on have just tribute in such keeping as yours. So this was a dedication to the women as well of the South. But these people were just all horrible, right? Just horrible people. They didn't respect anybody, didn't respect women, didn't respect anything. Again, perception. Perception. Now, of course, the leftists will call out these women as being evil people. They do it all the time. But it's perspective. It's perception. And then you get Calhoun, which this is one of the things that we have, one of the real problems with American historiography and American history in general, and of course American politics, is that we have reduced Calhoun to one phrase: positive good. That's it. If you ask Clyde Wilson the best biography of John C. Calhoun, he will tell you Gustavus Pinckney's The Life of John C. Calhoun. And so I went out and I found, you can get this work free online, and I just picked a chapter, the concluding chapter from it, and reproduced it on the website. You should read the whole book. A lot of it is quoting from Calhoun himself, his primary sources. But one of the things he says in the book, he leaves the defense of slavery until later in the book, which is interesting. He makes, and this is a case I've made with Calhoun many times. He says, look, if Calhoun had never waded into this subject, he still would have been one of the greatest and most memorable people in the history of the United States, because of all the things he said about government, about banking, about finance, about commerce. All of those things made him one of the most important people ever, and those things trumped anything he ever said about slavery. Slavery, in fact, was below that. And I've said before that Calhoun's positions on slavery weren't even that unique. People had said these things before throughout the United States. If you read Larry Tice's book, Pro-Slavery, he points out that Northern theologians were saying these things as early as 1701. There wasn't really anything unique about what Calhoun said about slavery. It's just that Calhoun was the most conspicuous person to say these things because he was one of the most prominent United States senators when he did it. He had been vice president of the United States. He had been Secretary of War. He would be Secretary of State. He was a candidate for president. So when Calhoun said these things, people listened. And so that's why Calhoun becomes the man who says all this stuff, and nobody else had ever said these things. Well, of course, this simply isn't true. People said these things before Calhoun said it many times. But his contribution to American society is not that. And this is why we still celebrate Calhoun on this, at the Abbeville Institute, on this podcast, and on our website. And this chapter is entitled His Richest Legacy to Posterity. And that would be the two books that he produced, or that were produced after his death. His Disquisition and Discourse. They are the real first works of political science in the history of the United States, in a comprehensive way. And they should still be studied across the United States and, of course, across the globe for the way that he dealt with things like minorities. How does Calhoun wrestle with this issue of political minorities? Because, of course, we're dealing with that subject almost all the time. We know that if you just go with a mere numerical majority, it seems that conservatives in America are always going to be outvoted. They don't give enough stuff away, right? If you just go with numerical majorities. So Calhoun was dealing with that. He was dealing with this issue, trying to wrestle with this. How do we make this work? How do we work with numerical minorities or majorities and numerical minorities? How do we protect the numerical minority? And you could say this is any numerical minority, well, you give them a veto, essentially. You allow them. And he said this is all in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment allows this to happen. But you give them a veto. He called it the concurrent majority, the real majority. And so you would have real majorities. Essentially, you would have supermajorities at any time to pass any legislation. That would be required, not just a mere 50 plus 1, which is what we've seen in the United States Senate here recently. The Senate, 50 plus 1. You've got a 50-50 tie. The tie is broken by the vice president. We've seen it now just recently. So he would say that's wrong. Right? You don't do that. You have to have a concurrent majority, meaning you'd have to have at least that 2/3 or 3/4 to get anything done. You'd have to at least give in to the minority in some ways. Now, we don't believe that anymore because the left won't do it. And Calhoun pointed out why that would be the case, why they wouldn't do it, because they or whoever's in control of the government can be any faction controlling the government. They wouldn't do it because they just want the power. And those out of power are going to consistently talk about how the Constitution should be their shield when they're out of power. And so he said that's going to be the case no matter who's in office, right? This is how it's going to work. So we need to come up with some check on that in society, because if we don't, we're always going to have this kind of extensive conflict. And he was right about this, right? I mean, Calhoun was right about these things. And that's what Pinckney points out here. You know, if nothing else had ever been done, if that positive good thing was never there, people should look to Calhoun anyways because of the things he said about society and government. And he thought that people would look to Calhoun many years. He wrote this book in the early 20th century, many years from this point forward. He thought people would look to Calhoun. He was incorrect. All they're doing now is tearing him down. But he thought that people would be wise enough to say, this guy had something to say about these things. We should still look to Calhoun for this stuff. We should still go back. But see, that would require people to overlook what would be considered his transgressions, his political transgressions. And this is what, there's a new book out, Yoram Hazony, and I think we're going to get somebody to review it for the website. Yoram Hazony wrote a book on conservatism, and he makes this case in the book against Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk wrote his book, The Conservative Mind, back in the 1950s, and Hazony's trying to update that with a new, essentially conservative mind. And he leaves out Calhoun and the South. And he tells you why he does it, because Calhoun and the South are stained by slavery. And so you can't talk about them. Russell Kirk was blind to this. Russell Kirk didn't understand this. This wasn't real conservatism in America. And if you talk about Calhoun, you're always going to be charged with being pro-slavery. And we can't have that, right? Because that just doesn't work for us rhetorically. And this is what I've said about Harry Jaffa and all the Jaffaites in making equality a conservative principle. They just wanted to try to deflect that or try to parry that and say, well, this isn't us. We're the real conservatives with equality, not you. Equality is really conservative. You are something else. They're trying to take that off the table. It won't work. It doesn't matter what Hazony says. This is the charge that's going to be made anyways. So you might as well look to the real people who were conservatives in America. Calhoun called himself that. He called himself a conservative. You know who didn't call themselves conservatives? Middle 19th century Republicans. In fact, they made fun of conservatives, and they used that term. But those are the people that are supposedly conservative now. It just doesn't make any sense. These people are lost. They're lost. And they're lost because they're picking people that aren't really conservative as conservatives. And look, we know this, right? The piece by Clyde on Monday, The Better Men, it's a really interesting piece. It's a piece on John William Corrington, who we've talked about on this website before, on this podcast before. But it's a review of a book, And Wait for the Night. And there's a quote in it, or a quote that Clyde gives you. He says, the book reminds me of an observation by Confederate editor and historian Edward Pollard in 1866. The Confederates have gone out of this war with the proud, secret, deathless, dangerous consciousness that they are the better men. And that's what you get from reading this book, right? Corrington, it's a book about Reconstruction. He says the book cannot be published today by any respectable press, although it first appeared in 1965 under such auspices. Corrington's portrayal of Northerners is far too honest and realistic. He shows us the numerous crooks, the Boston fanatic who wants to wipe out the Southern people, the time servers, the duped cannon fodder, and the few men of conscience who had reservations about the Reconstruction they are enforcing. His portrayal of the freedmen coping with the New World is sympathetic. Corrington, like any first-rate rank writer, is a realist who does not hesitate to picture the rough edges of Southern society while sympathizing with our people. There are the turncoats, the profit-makers, and the men irrevocably hardened by war and violence, and others whose souls have been left adrift because their understanding of the world has been hopelessly shattered. And this is, what we need to understand about what happened, right? It's perceptions. Reconstruction was great, or Reconstruction was an unfinished revolution, and these Southerners deserved it. That is a radical Republican view of Reconstruction. In fact, the very term Reconstruction comes from the radical Republicans. They said what Reconstruction meant, which was the complete transformation of Southern society. That's what they said they were doing. That's what Reconstruction is. The antithesis of that was restoration. And they thought that others in the North, of course, were pushing restoration. They wanted Reconstruction. Reconstruction was not going back to the old Constitution. They wanted the Constitution as it is, as there was a speech a radical gave, the Constitution as it is, and the way they were interpreting it in the 1860s. That, they said, is the Constitution as it is. Right? So this is an interesting way to look at things. I think the more interesting group in the 1860s is the radicals, because they tell you what they're going to do. They're telegraphing it all. They're telling you, this is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. And there was a resistance to that in Northern Democrats. And of course, when the South came back in, and they said this too, we can't let the South come back in, the Union, and align themselves with the Northern Democrats, because then we lose. They told you. They told you the whole time what they were doing. So what they did was ensure that the South could not have any impact for about 20 years, and they tried to foist their vision of what America needed to be on the rest of the United States. And there was a negative reaction to this, and people pushed back, and eventually the radicals were defeated. But all of the talking points that are used about the South are found in these speeches. All of them. And of course, you get this false dichotomy, righteous North and evil South. And the piece by Phil Lee on Tuesday, Northern Negrophobia, speaks to this, right? And how there was efforts made by members of Congress to resettle freedmen in parts of the West or in the North to give them a chance outside the South. This is always rejected by Northerners. Always rejected. No, we're not going to do that. And these are the Republicans that are rejecting these overtures. These are Republicans that are rejecting the efforts to try to alleviate what could be a real problem, which was how to deal with the end of slavery in the South and any kind of racial backlash. So it was thought, well, let's diffuse them. Let's put them in the West. Let's put them in the North. Let's try to spread them out a little bit. So there is an effort to try to solve this problem so people aren't going to be fearfully punished or whatever the case may be, rejected every time. And of course, we know people like David Wilmot of Pennsylvania. The Wilmot Proviso was not something that was done to in terms of altruistic reasons. He wanted the Western territories to be for white men only. He said it. I mean, this is what Northerners said over and over again. They said it. Now, of course, there were Northerners who were thinking in terms of humanitarian reasons for trying to end slavery or what they were doing in their legislation. There were some, but most of them were not. This was a political move for them, and they recognized it. I think even Thad Stevens recognized it. When they talked about not supporting colonization, generally it was, we need to keep these people in the South where they're from because, of course, that's going to be political power for them. They're going to support the Union Party, which, of course, was them. This is going to be votes for generations out. And so we can keep Republicans in office winning if we keep freed men in the South. So it was a politically calculated move for that. And again, the Republicans are always this, right? This is the final piece of the week, Paul Yarborough's The Red Ripple. There's been a lot of talk about the upcoming 2022 election and what it's going to mean the Republicans are going to take back control of the House or the Senate or whatever. Maybe it's going to happen. Maybe it won't happen. Yarborough doesn't think it's going to happen. But I have to say this, and I've said this before. The Republican Party is the same party it was in the 1860s. The Democrats are not. What's happened in America is that there isn't really a conservative party anymore, and the South has been completely left behind, particularly Southern conservatives. And the Republicans are just what they are. They've been called the stupid party because they are that. But this is, I mean, if you read the piece, I think he makes a pretty convincing case that there isn't really anyone in the United States that would be in line with, say, an old American conservative position. It just doesn't exist. We've got two left-wing parties, and that is something that's been around since the 1860s, though one of them, though the other one morphed into that really around the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. But anyways, hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.